Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech TV, and podcast platforms. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world are overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers and change makers in the movements for social justice. And we'll dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week on Rising Up for Justice, our guest is Reem Suleiman, Senior Campaign Director at Fight for the Future. She leads campaigns against surveillance and censorship online. Welcome to the program, Reem.
Thanks so much for having me, Sonali.
Tell me more about Fight for the Future. Let's focus on what this organization does. I've been following it for years, particularly around issues with net neutrality. It was an issue that Fight for the Future was one of the early fighters on. What are the main goals for the organization, and how do you go about achieving them?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's definitely evolved as the threats, to our democracy have evolved. And I think in this moment in particular, we really want to hone in on protecting people against censorship and surveillance, particularly when the stakes are so high and we see, abortion seekers being victimized. We see ICE's immigrant agenda terrorizing families across this country, and we see activists really having an intense target on their back for their work. And so we find it doubly important to focus in on those aspects of our work in this moment.
Is most of the work that Fight for the Future does focused on government attacks on people's rights or private attacks, corporate attacks as well?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there is so much blurring between some of these attacks because there has been so much collusion between, the tech industry in particular and government fascism. And so, for example, we see some of these things reinforcing themselves. We see terrible legislation that maybe is written in the name of kid safety, but actually, functions as a censorship mechanism being passed in, countries and states. And the aftermath of these age verification laws, or really online ID checks, is that the tech sector will respond with, these policies and these measures where they are needing to or claiming that they need to ask people for their government IDs in order to be able to access content, which is incredibly scary, thinking of certain contexts. Like imagine you are an abortion seeker in a very hostile state. Your way of accessing that reproductive health care is going to be online. And so if you have to submit your government ID, for example, to access a forum on Reddit or on Facebook or on YouTube, right, that just opens the door for government surveillance and for that person to be targeted for, something that we think should be a protected right for everybody.
So, in other words, the tech companies, the private entities are the ones that create the technologies and are happy to work with the government because they get the government contracts via taxpayer money, and the government is happy to use this technology. So it's a collaboration between government and the private sector that is impacting our rights online that Fight for the Future is fighting against.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's mutually beneficial. One of the big bad actors that we are constantly up against in the surveillance world is flock safety, which makes license plate reader cameras that so many law enforcement officers all around the country use as a part of their surveillance network. And we oftentimes find this like mutually beneficial relationship between the private surveillance vendors and, government actors, particularly law enforcement. And so it's really hard to break that through the public interest. But like those are exactly the kinds of relationships we're hoping to expose and push back against so that we actually have, redirecting so that we're actually able to redirect those resources towards things that matter.
Tell me a little bit about the history of Fight for the Future. What was the impetus for founding this organization? I imagine that it has really gone hand in hand with the rise of the internet, that this is something that really was meant to address ongoing challenges facing people as the internet has become more and more sophisticated.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned net neutrality, and I think that was one of the big flashpoints that really raised our visibility. But I think it was exactly, the threat of the internet as we knew it and the best parts of the internet, which allow people to find community in unusual places and give people access to information and spaces and platforms that they otherwise wouldn't have had. We're a queer-led organization. And obviously, there are critical LGBTQ plus resources that can only be accessed through the internet. And so I think Fight for the Future really was able to move the needle quite a bit on net neutrality, particularly, leveraging popular public campaigns that got the attention of artists and celebrities and musicians alike to, yeah, keep the integrity of the internet, keep it as a free and open place of expression, and also protect the people who use the internet to organize and push movements forward. It feels like campaigns, that are trying to make demands, even of Congress and to regulatory agencies feel like they're going to be a bit hollow and a bit ineffective given the urgency of the moment that we're in right now.
And so the battle lines shift depending upon who is in power in the White House and in
Exactly.
Congress.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
who gets pulled from these commissions and like what their
right.
particular motives are. And so it's been, I think, frustrating, but also I think because there is also like always the threat of overturn or always the threat of reinstatement. That's part of the reason why the worst case scenarios of net neutrality going away like haven't actually materialized in terms of the public sector, uh, because like there's always going to be that threat of litigation or the threat that the pendulum could swing the other way. So in a way, like even if we haven't been able to like permanently over the course of this time reinstate net neutrality, I do think that it has been preventative in terms of like having the worst case scenario, which is to have, service providers uh, be able to charge differently or throttle traffic differently, to the sites that maybe pay them more. And I think it's retained for the most part free and open access to the internet. And part of it has been because there has been such continuous organizing and continuous pressure, even when we find that we get the pies of the world taking back and backtracking on net neutrality. I think the threat of that reinstatement has kept the corporate sector, at least, and service providers from running wild with our worst case, scenario
Right.
nightmares.
I imagine that some of your biggest obstacles to getting your work done is just the fact that there is an enormous amount of money to be made in the tech sector, to especially be made, easy money to be made by becoming a government contractor. And then if you have an authoritarian government in power, people's rights are essentially sold to the highest, to the best bidder. And so I'm wondering if that, is that a big obstacle for you? What are the main obstacles that you face? And is the sort of money in tech and the corporate profit incentives pretty tough to counter?
Yeah, I'm glad that you raised this because public procurement and these government contracts are a huge portion of the economy, and they get underlooked. And I think oftentimes, I guess it's not surprising to me that a lot of tech companies have figured out that it is very easy to sell a technical solution to a social problem, right? And so I see this time and time again with surveillance. Rather than addressing any of the root causes that actually affect crime statistics and why, people necessarily have to resort to certain issues and without like actually addressing the social and economic issues that underlie some of those scary statistics. It's so much easier to just sell a city or a law enforcement agency or even, members of the community on the idea that a camera or a bit of, novel surveillance technology is going to make them safer, because it's not the case. And unfortunately, it is a very, very effective selling point to feed off of these fears that people have and all of the fear mongering that we see in the media. Even when crime statistics are down, you would not be able to tell it watching the local news. And tech vendors and surveillance tech vendors have found this to be incredibly a very profitable enterprise, and it's a huge, burden to us, and we oftentimes have to do a bit of that hand holding because and explain just one that we have no way to verify the claims that a lot of these vendors make, like where we don't actually have very much insight to know whether what they claim, their tech does on the box does what it says it will. And this is an issue that I encountered time and time again, when I was on the Privacy Commission for the city of Oakland, where like my job was essentially to review any sort of surveillance contracts that the city and the law, especially like the police department, wanted to obtain against like the civil liberties implications. And we just had to take these vendors' claims at face value. They could totally fudge the statistics of like, and oftentimes they do lie and they do make false claims or misleading claims or things that people cannot independently verify. And it's very, very effective and very, very profitable for them. But, I think more and more people, especially now, especially seeing how an ICE agent is able to snap a photo of a protester, run it through a facial recognition app on their phone, and then be able to harass that person in seconds by name. I think people are starting to understand the trade-offs, whereas before, perhaps they felt more hypothetical to people. And so I definitely think, the surveillance vendors are having to pull out more stops to try and convince, public officials and people that this stuff actually is something worthwhile. And I think part of that evidence is in the rapid growth and momentum of the deflock movement. Not sure how much you've been following it, but essentially, we have more and more cities every day, it feels like, that have decided to cancel their contracts with Flock, which is a surveillance camera meant to scan license plate readers, and it's, ubiquitous at business parking lots, on city traffic lights, even in neighborhoods. And we have over 90 cities across the country that have either paused or terminated their contract with Flock. And I think that's an indicator that people are starting to, one, understand how dangerous and how much some of these vendors are complete liars, and two, like the cost to themselves and to their community, that it literally keeps their neighbors less safe, even though it's sold as a public safety tool. So I think it's a very important and like, yeah, underemphasized aspect of, the public contracting and like, yeah, what impact it has on people.
Right, and some of what you're saying is very much relevant to the very disturbing news that we recently heard of a number of defendants in what's called a prairie land suit in Texas, North Texas, who were sentenced to 30 to 100 years based on the government's new definition of Antifa terrorism. And so these sorts of technologies only kind of feed into the criminalization of protest, right? Which is really, really disturbing.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned it because I think it perfectly captures like that moment of severity that we're in and why we at Fight for the Future are pivoting everything to try and protect, the activists on the front lines who are going to be the ones who, frankly, get us out of this moment. If we have a fighting chance of reclaiming our democracy and turning this ship around, it's going to be because of the direct action and the brave and fearless activists on the front lines. So we want to be able to protect their ability to do that by protecting things like end-to-end encryption and tools like Signal, where activists are organizing and make sure that they're able to do so safely. And this is something that there have definitely been historical flashpoints that feel similar. Obviously, this is quite a severe outcome. But I grew up in a post 9/11 America as a Muslim Palestinian kid where I had seen, government surveillance for like up close in terms of some of the activism that myself or, my colleagues were doing. I think we've also seen the way that student protesters have been uh, criminalized with the encampments over the past couple of years, and just how severe the administration's response has been. And there have been deportations of international students and lots of international students who are frankly too afraid to come to this country, seeing how severe the crackdown has been. And so these things feel, unfortunately, a little bit familiar. But the lesson that I take from that post 9/11 huge expansion of the national security surveillance state, which undoubtedly just meant an expansion of racial profiling. For anybody who's Black and brown in America, will understand and clock this issue quite easily. But the lesson really to take is non-compliance is so important, and pre-compliance is super dangerous and only, puts people at greater risk. And so really what this verdict did was to send a message and to try and to scare us into being quiet. But really that is only going to rapidly degrade and escalate, the fascist takeover as we know it. So I understand like this is very scary to process, and that's why we find that it's incredibly important to be bold and be unabashed in resisting surveillance and resisting censorship, particularly so that we can protect, activists on the ground.
Well, speaking of being bold and unabashed, how does Fight for the Future address or unfold narrative in your work? How do you tell the story of the importance of what you're doing? Because these days, storytelling is so much. People consume information through social media rather than factual news articles. We are drawn to those people who can tell effective stories, and whoever tells effective stories kind of shapes culture, sets agendas. Does Fight for the Future emphasize storytelling and narrative in your work?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we don't have to grasp very far to find, stories that really connect the dots between some of the issues and why people should care about it. And, as we're speaking just this week, I'm not sure how much you have been following some of the drama at Madison Square Garden, but there have been a series of exposés that really dig into the intensity of their surveillance system, and they've been employing for some time now facial recognition technology. And I believe a Wired article was exposing the way that they had been tracking a trans woman who was just a Knicks fan and like went to dozens of games throughout the years, but they used facial recognition technology to track her every move within the stadium, step by step, into every single bathroom visit, and were, you know, using the technology to also have the staff surveil her in real time, just so they could make sure that she would not show up on cameras like at the game, because they didn't want it to, air quotes, affect their reputation by having, a trans woman visible at the game. And so
Oh
this
my
is something,
God.
yeah, yeah, it's shocking. And
Wow.
to make things worse, we just found out a couple days ago, thanks to investigations from 404 Media, that James Dolan and Madison Square Garden officials have kept a dossier on activists who oppose facial recognition technology, and our co-director Evan Greer is on that list, and as are like some of our closest allies. And so they literally have a document that is, labeled facial recognition activists, and they are, watching the people who are speaking out against this as well. So it's very unfortunately easy to tell these stories when, we're not talking about hypotheticals anymore. Like, these are real use cases for this technology, and we don't have to talk about a dystopian future because we're unfortunately already there.
In terms of the victories that you have won, how do you tell the story of that? Because sometimes the bad news can kind of discourage people into not wanting to think about it because it feels overwhelming. But Fight for the Future has enjoyed successes. And also, one of the things that I noticed on your website is that you share your playbook. I imagine that having other people, not being the only organization is being the only organization is not a good thing, right? Doing this, the more people, the more organizations that get involved, the better. And so, how do you share your victories, and how do you encourage others to join your fight?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's very important to, like, when we find something that works, especially because does not have, if it was so easy and if there was a recipe to winning victories, like, we would have a radically different world right now. So oftentimes when we find something that works, there's no guarantee that it's going to work for something else, but it is very strategic to try and replicate it in things that make sense. And so, I'll give an example. We are currently um, trying to organize artists to join a pledge to not play at any venue that has facial recognition technology. And I think, Madison Square Garden, the fact that they feel compelled to keep tabs on the people who are speaking out just shows exactly how concerned they are. And they have reason to be concerned. There are victories that Fight has contributed to. There was a Red Rock amphitheater that was trying to do palm scanners for entry at their stadiums, and the Fight for the Future, launched a campaign and essentially, you know, got them to refuse to do, like, to not roll it out, which was a huge victory. And we got over 100 artists already to sign a pledge saying that they won't play at any venue that does have facial recognition technology. And so it's really great to be able to tell that story of that victory, of, all of the movement that's happened, and all of the like, just the growing number of artists that are taking a really principled stand for moments like right now in San Francisco. I'm based in the Bay Area. We have three gay bars in the Castro that are using TSA style facial recognition technology for entry. And so it's really helpful to be able to show people that, we can win these fights. And I think it can help motivate people to take further action on, and feel like they have space to do something about it.
And then how can people join you who are just interested in supporting the work of Fight for the Future? Do you have a way for, people to sign up for a newsletter? Is it a membership organization? Are there local chapters? What's the way in which the public can engage directly with Fight for the Future?
Yeah, there are so many ways, like whether somebody wants to be a donor or somebody who wants to be on our email list. I think following us on social media and visiting our website and getting subscribed to our newsletter is the best way to learn about activation moments. But we really do rely on people signing our petitions or using our toolkits. So like we oftentimes do toolkits for organizers, for people who, want to essentially replicate a campaign in their own city, in their own capacity. Because like a lot of this work, we're a very, very small team and we're distributed across the country. So we don't have like big local chapters or big member chapters, but we're trying to, use the limited resources that we have to have an outsized impact as much as possible. And so there are always like call outs for people to help engage on our corporate campaigns, calling up companies, emailing companies, or writing to their politicians about things like, bad online ID check bills. There's so many different ways to engage, but definitely follow us you can follow us on Instagram at Fight for the Future, FTR, instead of spelling out the full future, and get subscribed to our email list, which will give you so many ways, probably overwhelming a number of ways to feed into this, but we appreciate any and all of the support.
Well, Reem, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Best of luck to you. We'll certainly post links to the website and social media from our page. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sonali. Thanks for having me.
My guest has been Reem Suleiman. She is Senior Campaign Director at Fight for the Future, where she leads campaigns against surveillance and censorship online. And this is Rising Up for Justice. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer of this new weekly half-hour series, exclusive to viewers of Free Speech TV and of subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.